What does patriotism mean? To many, it's the pride or confidence you have in a particular nation, territory, region, or country. It's kind of like school pep, but on steroids. But in the same way that you don't really get to choose what school you go to, your parents make that decision for you, you don't really get to decide where you're born. Your parents make that decision for you too, and their parents made that decision for them. But nevertheless, you still end up going to high school football matches and shouting, "Go Wildcats," or you end up breaking into "God Save the Queen" at grand state occasions. But if the genesis of patriotism is something so arbitrary, where you were born, it has nothing to do with your capabilities or ability, does it really have any use today? Many people would say yes, and they'd point to some of history's greatest leaps forward as evidence. They have been attributed to patriotism. For example, let's cast our minds back to 1969. The US sent a man to the moon, and this was following a period of intense rivalry between America and the Soviet Union. Both were vying for dominance here on Earth, but also in space, and as a byproduct, patriotism was able to fuel some of the greatest leaps forward that mankind has seen in technology, space travel, and sadly warfare. So where is that line between patriotism and something slightly more nefarious? See, the example that I've just given obviously advanced the entirety of mankind, not just America or the USSR. The Great Leap Forward was for all of us. But something else is present in this example, and countless other examples where patriotism is evidenced as a fuel for progress. The presence of war. Because pride in one's national identity has all too often let ego overpower the desire to strive for the common good. Now, let me pose a counterfactual, which sounds ridiculous, but how much sooner would we have landed on the moon if Americans and Russians had worked together? Now, it even sounds preposterous to say, but I think the answer is, of course, much sooner. Years ago, under monarchs, many sacrificed their lives for petty squabbles between two rulers. War was prioritized over progress. But one could level the same accusation, for the modern age that we live in. We don't have to look too far into history to think of a good example of the opposite force in action, the benefits of international collaboration. One of the very first coronavirus vaccines was engineered by an ethnically Turkish couple working in a German laboratory in conjunction with an Austrian professor. The coronavirus did not discriminate along the lines of national borders or religion or ethnicity, and clearly the same can be said about the solution. It could not have been achieved if only people from one group, locality, or one country was allowed to work on the issue. In fact, scientists have found that collaboration is key. Recent studies have shown that diversity in experience and opinion leads to significantly faster problem solving. Psychologists conducted a study where they presented a few problems and puzzles to individuals grouped together by ethnicity, age, gender. It was found that groups with the most similar demographic characteristics were the least efficient at problem solving, and the more diversity there was in a group, the more efficiency there was, and the quicker they were to solve those puzzles. So I think it's fair to conclude that if we did not have the serendipity of having Turkish-German scientists working with an Austrian professor in a German laboratory, we would not have had the breakthrough that we did as quickly as we did, or in the way that we did. Cooperation should definitely not dilute patriotism, but should accentuate it. Collaboration is now key. Skeptics at this juncture might say, hang on a second. The reason why America and Russia did not collaborate had nothing to do with ego. It was because of completely distinct value systems. And this is something that you hear of more and more in the news. British values, American values, Indian values, French values. But when you deconstruct those rhetorical tools, you begin to understand that Indian, Russian, and American politicians claim to stand for the same things: freedom, liberty, equality, justice. There can be no monopoly by one nation on any of these values, and in fact, the fact that so many politicians are using them should prompt us to understand how much we actually share, how much we have in common. But where does this leave us in regards to our main question? What is the right kind of patriotism? And this brings me to a situation from the early 2010s. There was a great debate in New York about whether a mosque should be built in the vicinity of Ground Zero, where of course the 9/11 attacks occurred. and there were fierce arguments on both sides. I remember thinking to myself, what would be the biggest victory for America in this particular situation? Would it be showing that they are indeed a land of pluralism, that they do not shun any religion or community, and they will tolerate freedom of religion and expression even when it's politically contentious? Or would they rather send a signal, a very clear signal, that America is not compatible with a certain group of people? I think enemies are more often defeated with acts of compassion than with drones or missiles, and in that particular instance, the American politicians definitely chose compassion. In recent years, some have diminished patriotism to simply be about territory, language, or ethnicity. However, I believe not only is this too simple a definition, but it stunts the progress of the very group or country that you're trying to protect or improve. Now, if we name just a few examples, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Malala Yousafzai, these are all people that arguably found their greatest voice in countries where they were not born. I believe that the UK and the US were better off for their inclusive vision of patriotism. Now, if we had simply viewed patriotism to mean you can only be part of our group if you look this way, speak this way, dress this way, then we would have lost the theory of relativity, leaps forward in psychology, and a powerful advocate for women's rights. So what I am suggesting is that we should flip the whole debate on its head. Patriotism should be about inclusion and not exclusion. For example, I was born in Britain, attended a very British school, sang hymns every morning and had fish and chips every Friday lunch as a school meal. But as you might have guessed, my ancestors were not from anywhere near here, or anywhere near Hertfordshire where my school was. In fact, they are from 4,000 miles away. The first person in my family to make that 4,000-mile voyage were my grandparents. They both went to medical school in India, then they came to the UK where my grandmother worked in the NHS and my grandfather taught at Oxford, and then they eventually settled in Pakistan a few years later, where they founded a hospital that served the city of Karachi for over 30 years. Now the simple question at hand is, does India, Britain or Pakistan have to shun any of their achievements? Do their contributions mean less simply because they were elsewhere at a different time in a different context? I would argue the answer is a resounding no. In my experience, at the European Parliament, where I was lucky enough to be working on behalf of British political parties, I was concerned with, of course, advancing British interests on a day-to-day basis. However, one week there was a trade delegation from Pakistan, and having a Pakistani heritage allowed me to strike up a very natural conversation with them, because of my affinity with their background and their culture. And as they had never been to the European Parliament before, I shared some of my very few insights about how the institution worked, where certain offices were, and I hoped those tidbits of information proved useful to them and in achieving their goals. In small moments like this, not grand moments, small moments, we realize that very few of us are so monolithic that we can only attribute our ancestry or lineage or background to a set place or a set language. If we could, we'd all be more boring for it. Patriotism is not about choosing what part of your identity to bolster and what part of your identity to diminish. Patriotism is about finding the harmony within yourself to be the best contributor you can, wherever you can do it. By helping a different group, you don't necessarily do it at the expense of the group that you already belong to. This fact reminds me of an episode of an American talk show where a white nationalist member enthusiastically took a blood test, trying to establish the purity of his bloodline, so sure that it would come out as he expected. But it turned out that he was part African American. And that illustrates how we have to accept diversity. It's not an option. It's who we are. The world is no longer, if it really ever was, a collection of monolithic tribes where language, ethnicity, or religion could tightly unify populations. Of course, it's an intoxicating idea. If I speak a certain way or live a certain way, it's very tempting to try and preserve that way of life because that's all I've known, and that's all my parents knew, and that's all my grandparents knew. However, just as we have all grown to learn, whether we're students, working in jobs, in academia, success lies outside your comfort zone. The world is full of 7 billion unique stories. It would be conceited and arrogant to assume that by cordoning off these 50 million people, we're serving that group the best. The best way to serve any smaller group is by opening the doors to the best and the brightest ideas and people of the remaining 6,950,000,000 people. A project that I've started seeks to do just that, by allocating human capital as efficiently as possible around the world. We do this simply by taking talent from one country and deploying it in companies or organizations in other countries who have a shortage of similar talent in local areas. Our ethos is very simple. Just as most problems are not unique to individual countries, solutions are very rarely found in a specific place. Many of the problems that developing countries face can be solved by acumen and capital being moved from more developed countries to them. And conversely, many problems within developed countries are solved on a day-to-day basis by human capital that has actually been imported from developing countries. The typical model for the first iteration is, of course, charity. People view charity as a quick and easy way of alleviating many of the developing world's problems by simply shifting money or financial capital from the rich to the poor. However, my project believes that a more sustainable way of looking at this is by saying that this is not an us and them issue. It's not merely the rich giving to the poor. And we have to stop dealing with global challenges through the lens of narrow patriotism. That will allow us to become much more innovative with our solutions. Right now, the most pressing challenges facing both developing and developed countries have nothing to do with national borders or the color of your passport. The coronavirus pandemic, global warming, mass poverty. Viruses and famines do not ask for your passport before delivering punishment onto you. That's why we should not think that passports or nationalities can include or exclude us from being part of the solution. One example from the work our organization does is a textile company in rural Pakistan, which creates jeans and clothes that we wear on a day-to-day basis. They supply for some of the major brands in Europe. The retailers that buy clothes and garments from them had demanded that the factories that run in Pakistan reduce their carbon emissions by 25% within the next 5 years if they wanted to continue being a supplier. Now, of course, that was prompted by European legislation. So the retailers acted in a way that all retailers would in that situation. They did not have regard for the context that those suppliers in Pakistan were in. For example, some key questions they no doubt didn't ask were, where would they get the expertise to reduce the carbon emissions? How would the company in Pakistan fund it? And more importantly, what of the unemployment caused by it? So this is where our organization steps in. We were actually able to get expertise from across the world, from California to Pakistan, to solve a problem that the factory was having with a retailer in France. The expertise that we found was able to build a sustainable plan for the factory, allowing them to reduce their carbon emissions whilst maintaining a similar level of employment, and it did not jeopardize their capital reserves, which was of course a key aim of theirs. So what began as a problem for a French retailer was solved by American expertise in a very Pakistani context. And because the solution was actually reducing carbon emissions, it actually helped us all. By striving for the most efficient allocation of human capital, we are not solving only local or national problems, although it seems so. We are solving global problems. In the process, we don't need to be less proud of great French retailers, American know-how, or Pakistani manufacturing. They are all working in tandem and in a symbiosis. I think this type of thinking is the future, and that's something we need to adopt to tackle the world's most pressing problems. The problem with attributing patriotism to simple characteristics like skin color or language or religion is that this will leave us fundamentally ill-equipped for the future, because that's not the direction of history. If I created a typewriter company in the 1930s, I might have made a steady income for the next 40 years, but eventually I would have gone bankrupt if I continued selling just typewriters. We need to know when simplistic ideologies that class us by race or language or ethnicity have become bankrupt. Far into the future, there will be no such thing as a majority white or a majority black country. Human nature will ensure that all our distinct lineages and heritages will be mangled and cross-wired, and the only thing that unites us is our diversity, as well as our motivation to solve global problems. The future will belong to those countries that prepare for this eventuality by attaching their patriotism to the idea of inclusive and compassionate growth, not simply exclusion. If we don't voluntarily change our opinion on what patriotism is and start adopting this inclusive vision, there is no doubt it will be changed for us. Just as at the turn of the 19th century, religious institutions were being overcome by national state structures, we're now seeing that state-endorsed structures are being overcome by technological platforms that frankly don't care what your race is, your language is, your background is, or where you were born. Let's think about it for a second. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn are probably all more powerful in their reach and impact than most national structures around the world. They don't need a national identity card or a passport to sign on to any of these platforms, and in many ways, states are becoming very deferent to their power. There are a few trends that are making this more and more evident. The first is something that we've recently seen: borderless cryptocurrencies that are thriving without the endorsement of any major institution, any major bank, any central bank. The fact that social media has become the major forum for public discourse and has no national eligibility requirements. And on a broader point, our digital identity is now almost more important than our real identity. And again, there's no need for a passport when you're Googling yourself. What's more important to employers? A reference that you've cherry-picked to give a great review of your character, or a quick Google search of who you really are? So we all now face a choice. Either we put up the drawbridge and try to wind back the clock so that we can live how our ancestors supposedly did millennia ago, or we can forge an inclusive brand of patriotism that is fit for purpose for the rest of the century. A patriotism that embraces the commonality of human beings rather than dwelling on small differences that appear much bigger than they are, especially when deployed in political speeches. There is no issue with remaining attached to the beauty of the Lake District or the taste of Yorkshire pudding or Lancashire hot pot, or even the achievements of individual British people where you're from. But by trying to forge a patriotism which suggests that global problems have narrow local solutions defined by borders, we will all lose out. Thank you.